He made the first science fantasy. That was King Kong. He became interested in a new film process, Technicolor. Through him, Technicolor came into practical use. A few years ago, that nose for novelty started twitching again, and suddenly there was a film called This Is Cinerama playing on Broadway. The ripples from it have come this way. They have generated quite a stir in our wonderful medium. In honor of all his innovations, the board has voted an honorary award to Merian C.
I just heard what was said. It isn't strictly accurate by any means. I'm a man that's just been lucky on having wonderful partners. Schoedsack really did a lot more than I did on Grass and Chain. And right down the line, I only had John Ford as a partner. Rib Chalmers is a great friend in Technicolor. And for Cinerama, my Fred Waller invented it. Lowell Thomas picked up the ball and ran with it. And there's a young man in this audience, Bob Bendick, that most of you never heard of, that did far more of the production than I did. I want to thank all the great partners I've had in my life. Thank you. I just want to add, I'm still John Ford's partner.
What do you remember of Marion? What was he like?
Gosh, he was larger than life. He visited my grandparents' house many times, and I was privileged to have lunch with he and my grandfather and family several times. And when my grandfather died, I was tasked with going up to JFK Airport in New York City and bringing Marion down for the funeral. I would say that I idolized him in a way, but clearly it was because of his incredible life that I heard stories about. He didn't talk to me directly about a lot of his life because he knew that had been filled in by my grandparents and my parents. He was larger than life. He was over the top. He was very ostentatious. He actually flew into Princeton Airport, which is a tiny little airport, for one of the stays with my grandparents on a private plane. I mean, that was the type of thing he did that drove his older brother, a very, very serious lawyer, just nuts, absolutely nuts. Although he was responsible for my grandfather Cooper getting the position as the founding attorney at Pan Am Airways in the early 30s, on which my Uncle Marion was a founding board member, and was the one who called him and said, "I've got a job for you," when they realized they really needed an attorney full-time, especially one who specialized in real estate, because they were looking for airports to create overseas. But on the Marion side, there were just stories after story after story about him and his legacy, what he had done, being shot down in World War I, escaping the Russians who had imprisoned him, and that kind of thing, which, of course, as a young man of in my early teens. I was just dazzled by. But he lived many lives. He went to the Lawrenceville School, which is about a mile down the road from where I live, along with his older brother. They both graduated from there. And it was known as the Northern Prep School for Southerners, really the only one in which Southerners were not only welcome, but predominant. And my grandfather went to Princeton University, which is also known as the Northern College of the South.
Willis O'Brien was pretty much the pioneer of special effects. He's the reason we have all that we have today, and it all stems back to his early work as a filmmaker. Obviously, stop motion was around prior to him discovering it, but when he discovered he could use clay figures and sculptures and move them frame by frame, he essentially invented the first massive special effects technical achievement for cinema. So he started by making a couple of dinosaur shorts for the Thomas Edison Company, and eventually got a job working on The Lost World with Harry Hoyt in 1925, which you could actually consider to be the first giant monster movie ever made, especially when you have the Brontosaurus attacking London, which is still, to this day, for 1925 standards, a lot of the special effects in that movie still hold up, and you think, how the hell did they do that back then? Because this is before digital trickery, this is before proper compositing even before digital. And all the effects to this day, they still look pretty damn impressive for the time. Harry Hoyt actually offered Willis O'Brien to do a follow-up dinosaur movie after The Lost World, which is sort of a semi-sequel in a way. And they were working on essentially Creation, which had a very interesting plot, and a lot of Willis O'Brien's canceled projects, like War Eagles and even Guanji, which Harryhausen himself made, are all worth a movie on themselves. Like War Eagles, it's Nazi airplanes attacking Manhattan with giant hawkmen on giant eagles in dogfights. It's pretty much a pro-Avatar final battle. How have they not made this a movie? I would pay to see that on the screen. It's original, and it looks... It just sounds like an amazing concept in and of itself.
I did a project on Willis O'Brien, I think when I was in 5th grade, and I made a big poster board up for him and all his accomplishments, and I wanted to see the dinosaur and the missing link and prehistoric poultry and the lost world. Kong was that gateway drug that inspired everything else, and ever since then, whenever I'm at a creative lull or creative low of anything, I'll put on Kong, or I'll watch a documentary about Merian C. Cooper or Willis O'Brien, and it instantly just revives my creativity and reminds me these guys did so much with so little at the time. And compared to what we have today and the technology we have today, there's really no excuse for young filmmakers or documentarians to pick up their computer and just make whatever they want, because you have these guys in the 30s that were doing the impossible.
Willis O'Brien is the guy who literally animated the first King Kong. And man, that is beautiful. And the Academy was like, dude, we want to give you an award for your work. And Willis O'Brien was like, now this is a hero. This is a hero. Willis O'Brien's like, I will accept it if you give everyone in the studio who worked on this with me the same award. And the Academy was like, wait, what? No, it doesn't work like that. He's like, no, I don't want it then. They didn't give it to him because of that, and he got ostracized as a result. He was kind of outside of Hollywood because he was a weirdo. But man, that is a hero. That is what Kong is That is what Godzilla is. They come in and they do the thing and nobody gives them the shout out. They go back to work. He would go on to do, I think it was Mighty Joe Young, is that it? And he worked with Ray Harryhausen. He got an Academy Award for that finally, and he absolutely deserves it. But a lot of heroes, they don't get the credit that they deserve. So much respect to Willis O'Brien, and thank you for giving us King Kong.
Willis O'Brien's film From the Lost World, the one scene where you have a T-Rex versus a Stegosaurus, he got a copy of that, arranged for a showing of that at a board meeting at RKO with the projectionist, and stormed into the board meeting late because he was a member of the board. He was meant to be there for the whole meeting, and said, "Gentlemen, I have something to show you which is just going to change the world." Turned out the lights, gave the signal to the projectionist. The doors at the far end of the board meeting opened to reveal the screen. They'd always had a screen there. It was RKO after all. And he showed this one scene. And in his description, he told me that the board members went nuts. He said, "Where did you find these prehistoric animals?" I mean, because it may look a little archaic to us today, but back in those days, nobody had ever seen anything like it. Now, this is how he told it to me. So that at the end of that, he then gave them the storyboard version of what his movie was going to be about, and that they needed to fund it. And remember, this is 1931, 32. The Depression has hit hard. It was clearly going to cost a bundle of money to make a movie like this, which it did. In fact, he went over budget. It was about a $200,000 movie, which at that time was just astoundingly expensive. I think he spent $250, he told me, something like that. But the results were that the world was in fact taken by storm about the technology, among which there is no question that Marion was fascinated by monkeys and apes. If you want to find the movie Chang, Chang, silent film he made in the early 20s with Schoedsack, his cameraman, you will see in that he used an ape as the main character, Chang. This is something that fascinated him for a long time. By the way, there's one scene in that which he described to me how it was filmed, because I had seen the movie. I don't know where I saw it, but it was during my grandfather's funeral week that he said, "Well, there's this one part that shows Chang running, and you will notice that he keeps running and running and running, and the camera is following him exactly, and you may wonder how that was done." And I said, "Now that I think of it, I'm curious." And he said that we actually attached him to a harness at the end of a long log, and the camera was at the center on a pedestal. So he was running around and around and around, and obviously the shot was just static. And that's the kind of inventiveness that made Marion famous in Hollywood.
I think Cooper was inspired by a book he read as a kid called Grand Tales in Equatorial Africa, where it had gorillas that were undiscovered at the time. Like, gorillas weren't discovered until 1902, I think, and they were dragging native women and children off into the jungle doing God knows what to them. And I think for Cooper, that not only inspired him to tell the story about this adventure of this giant beast in this uncharted island in the depths of a jungle, but also the Beauty and the Beast concept that came with it.
Cooper introduced me by correspondence to Ray Harryhausen. Of course, Ray had done the animation for Cooper in Mighty Joe Young, was the apprentice to Willis O'Brien. At that point, O'Brien was somewhat elderly, and so Harryhausen actually did 85% of the stop-motion animation on Joe Young. And so early in 1966, by way of introduction from Merian C. Cooper, I was introduced to Ray Harryhausen, and Ray and I were dear friends for close to 50 years. We had a very close correspondence as well. And I finally got to meet Ray. He lived, of course, in London. I got to meet Ray in 1981 when he was touring the U.S. On a promotional tour for Clash of the Titans. And after that, we got together on many, many occasions. He invited me to his home in London if I ever got overseas, which sadly I did not. But he was a dear friend, and I saw him many, many times over the years and until he passed. And I even hosted a 2.5-hour meeting with Ray Harryhausen and the fans. It was his first trip to the U.S. In 1990, specifically to do the convention tour. And he appeared at a convention in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was asked to host the show. And so there were Ray Harryhausen and I just sharing the stage together in front of about, I don't know, 500-700 fans in the room. And Ray brought out his models, and I asked him a lot of questions, took questions from the audience. Harryhausen was a huge film music nut. And so I took advantage of that to question him about Max Steiner, of course, Miklos Rozsa, and Bernard Herrmann in particular, who had scored a number of Harryhausen films. And he loved talking about the music of the movies. Long story short, after we finished the onstage interview with Ray and I helped him pack up his models, his little monsters, into his attaché case. And we walked out the door. Ray turned left to talk to the fans, and I turned right to join my then wife, Maria. And as Maria and I were walking out of the area, a man approached us with a woman and a little boy. And the man said, "Are you the gentleman who was on stage with Ray Harryhausen?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You were talking about the composer Bernard Herrmann?" I said, "Yes, that's correct." He pointed to his wife and son and said, "I'd like you to meet Bernard Herrmann's daughter and grandson." So I gasped, held my chest, and said, "Follow me." And we walked up to Ray, and I tapped Ray on the shoulder. He turned around and I said, "Ray, this is Bernard Herrmann's daughter and grandson." And he gasped and clutched his chest. And it was a lovely moment.
And now, before I tell you the full story of our voyage, I'm going to ask the gentlemen of the press to come forward, so that the audience may have the privilege of seeing them take the first photographs of Kong and his captors. All right, boys. Miss Darrow first alone. Stand in front of Kong. All set, Jack? Okay. Make it a good one. Shoot.
My life really changed when I was about 8 years old and I saw the original King Kong for the first time on television, because somehow I jumped from that little city in Southern California that I was in our house into our small black and white TV. And I was one of those sailors clinging to the log on Skull Island that Kong was trying to shake off. I felt such a strong identification with well, really everybody in this movie. And I think that's never really changed. You know, you relate to Kong, you relate to Anne and Jack, you relate to just about everybody in the movie, except maybe the dinosaurs, maybe not the T-Rex.
I was a child in the 50s and grew up in New York and New Jersey. And there was a thing called $1 Million Movie. And they would show a movie, the same movie, 3 times a day for a week. And I think I may have had the mumps, or for some reason I was home. And it was King Kong. And I got to watch it a lot. So by the end of the week, I kind of was reciting dialogue from it. But that was very long ago. And these were the days that when the idea of movies on TV was kind of novel. I mean, there was no color TV yet. I'm very old. And so it was a big deal that King Kong was on television, because it was already then, it was a landmark movie. And had, of course, in its day, had a million sequels, and there'd been no remakes, but there was Son of Kong and Bride of Kong, and Kong and the Japanese did a couple of versions of it later on, a little bit later on, but it was already a big deal. So, and it was already the highlight of Fay Wray's career, and she lived for many years afterwards.
I don't think I know a young boy who's ever not been a fan of King Kong. You know, there's something so mesmerizing about this iconic character, because I think humans always want to imbue humanity onto other animals, even though some of those animals don't really, you know, they're not smart enough to recognize humanity because they're not human. But humans on the whole love this creature and this primate, and I am one of them, and I hope it goes way into the future.
King Kong is a film that I first saw at about 6 o'clock on a weekday evening back in the 1980s on BBC Two, and I was into a lot of sort of fantastical films like Star Wars and E.T. and stuff like that, and it was a film that right from the beginning really captured my imagination. It's this fantastic, exciting, thrilling film. Its purpose really is to give you this exciting adventure ride and to stimulate the viewer's sense of imagination. It's got a great sense of mystery about it as well. I think part of the appeal of the film is that growing up through secondary school, I didn't really fit in that well. So I've had some sort of connection with outsiders. I mean, secondary school was a long time ago. From now, my life has happily moved on. So it has given me a certain connection with outsiders. And Kong there's a sense of he's an outsider. He's sort of misunderstood as a monster.
There's so many themes and storylines around this character, whether it be fitting in, whether it be love, whether it be trying to break away from the rules that society has brought on us and climb the mountains we're not supposed to show, hey, we can be important too. And that's one of the greatest themes of King Kong. There's no jungle more deadly than civilization. It's a dangerous world out there, and sometimes in the worst circumstances, as Carl Denham said in the original, trust who you care about and keep your chin up, because that's all you can do in today's world. And aside from that, Kong as a character has always been sort of the escapism from reality, and that not only applies to going to the movies, it applies to socializing in the system as a whole, where if we don't think something's right, we're gonna break through our chains and escape it and just enjoy that escapism.
Black and White has this otherworldly fantasy look and feel to it, almost in a dreamlike state. Color is too precise, too real. It's very difficult, I believe, to maintain an atmosphere of the suspension of belief or disbelief watching a color fantasy film. But Black and White has that dreamlike quality. And perhaps it goes back to the fact that in the early 1950s, my mom filled my head with stories about this giant gorilla and this wonderful movie, and the creature in New York, and carrying the girl to the top of the Empire State Building. The fact that I had dreamt for many years about Kong. And even to this day, I still on occasion have nightmares about hearing giant footsteps, looking out of my kitchen window and seeing a giant ape's head staring through the window. Of course, it's a timeless fantasy. It is Beauty and the Beast. And we've all been charmed and enchanted by that tale for time and immemorial. Ever since I first saw Kong, I fell head over heels in love with it. Even now, even the other night when it was shown on Turner Classic Movies, and I hear those three notes, bum, 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 and the letters racing toward the head of the face, or rather the front of the screen, almost 3D-like. My heart starts beating, and I'm totally wound up and involved in the story again. And as I say, it was just on a couple of nights ago. I think Wednesday evening, perhaps, or Thursday night on TCM, and I watched it from start to finish, and I found it as enchanting and exciting and thrilling as ever. And it's just a cherished memory in my life, a reality that I love bringing back every couple of weeks when it's on.
Max Steiner is, I think, the most influential composer. Max was the one who in 1929, the year that all the studios switched from silent movies to sound officially, in 1929, he was asked to leave his successful career as a Broadway conductor and come to Hollywood to do whatever they needed him to do for music. No one was really sure how music was going to work in the talkies. And he went to RKO, and within just months, he was made the head of the music department. And he was surprised to find out that filmmakers were very reluctant to put music underneath the dialogue in dramas or comedies. They were very reluctant to have music in films that wasn't music that we saw. And by that, I mean, if you didn't see a singer singing or a band playing, or if a record player wasn't playing, the producers would say to Max, if you write music that is just your own, won't the audience wonder where is the music coming from? And it took 2 years for him to convince the studio that this idea of underscoring was really going to help movies. And so we owe Max, really, we owe so much to Max, because he and the head of production in 1932 at RKO, David O. Selznick, very much agreed that adding underscoring to movies, like through underscoring, lots of music for different characters, that it would really make the films better. And Max not only pioneered many of the techniques of sound film underscoring, but he wrote many of its greatest scores, from King Kong to Casablanca to Gone with the Wind to The Searchers to Treasure of the Sierra Madre to The Big Sleep. I mean, it's an incredible list of films. So he wasn't just an innovator, he was one of the great dramatic composers of all time.
Uncle Marion and Edgar Wallace had an office together at the RKO headquarters building in New York City. Wallace was a naturalist. He believed that anything in nature was more powerful than man. My great uncle, obviously, as a World War I ace who believed in airplanes, which did contribute to his being dissed at the Naval Academy, because the Naval Academy was all about ships. And he thought that airplanes were the future. And the Navy at that point in the early 1910s, 11s, I guess he graduated from Lawrenceville in 1911, so it would have been 12, 13, 14. We're not thinking about aircraft at all. In fact, thought that aircraft was somehow limited in its capabilities. But he believed that aircraft were the most powerful thing man had ever invented. He said it could drop bombs, it could shoot incredible numbers of bullets, it could destroy anything. It was faster than anything else in the world. They were in their office, their desks abutted on each other, so they were facing each other across these two desks. And they were having an argument about natural versus man-made objects. And my Uncle Marion challenged Edgar Wallace to tell him what the most powerful natural thing on Earth would be. And Wallace said that could defeat man in man-made objects. And he said, well, it would have to be huge. It would have to be incredibly smart and very strong. And he said, therefore, I think immediately about an ape, a great ape, a prehistoric ape is what he said. This is as I was told. And Uncle Marion looked at him and said, fine, well, I bet you that my airplanes could shoot down your prehistoric ape. But the only thing is, how the hell would you ever get a situation where my airplanes would have a chance to shoot at this great prehistoric ape? And they looked out the window, and there was the Empire State Building being built. It was not finished. And he said, I'll tell you what, we put your ape up on top of that, and I'll take my airplanes and shoot down the son of a bitch. And they had to work backwards from that. That was clearly the ending of the film, which both of them had in their minds. And Wallace didn't dispute that if you had a great ape up on top of the Empire State Building, the airplanes, which would overpower him, would shoot him down. He didn't dispute that at all.
Faye Ray was actually born in Alberta, Canada, so she's Canadian, and at the time, she was already on a starring role. She was in 11 movies, I think, back then, from like 1932 to 1933. So when she got the part, Cooper had told her, "You're going to be working with the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood." And at first she was thinking it was actually going to be Cary Grant, but boy, was she mistaken. She was mostly in a giant hydraulic hand that would just move around, and it would be occasionally too tight on them, and that's part of the job of being one of Kong's girlfriends, essentially. What a lot of people don't know is that Carl Denham was actually inspired by Cooper himself. In fact, Jack and Carl were based on the duo of Cooper and Schoedsack, the two directors on the movie.
Now, there's no question that Carl Denham is a carbon copy of Uncle Marion. And there's absolutely no question. I mean, other people have sort of denied that, and historians have said, oh no, Carl Denham was just a creative director, producer. And I, watching that movie and having met my great uncle, no, that's my great uncle. He put himself in the film. And as you know, he really did put him and Schoedsack in the film. My great uncle in the cockpit and Schoedsack running the machine gun.
I think a big appeal of the film is that unlike a lot of these big modern franchise movies, these big adventure franchise movies, whereby they're instigated by a studio executive who's thought to themselves, well, this property has made a lot of money in the past, so we'll do a reboot of Superman or Godzilla or whatever, and the intent of that is to maximize profit. Obviously, it'd be naive to presume that part of the reason why King Kong was made was not to make a big hit. Obviously, Merian Cooper wanted a big hit, and RKO needed a hit. He also, of course, he was a documentary filmmaker, traveled the globe. He had a love of gorillas since a child, and it's something that genuinely inspired and excited his imagination. And you get a real sense of that watching the movie. It's a film that resonates a bit more deeply than these big modern blockbuster films like, let's say, Rampage. There's a lot more feeling invested in it. With the end of the movie, Kong's feelings for Anne have traveled. So it starts off that he just looks at her and she's an object of lust. By the end of the film, when he sort of glances down on her from the Empire State Building, and there's a look of sadness in his eyes, and you get this sense of he's fallen in love with her. And yet she's just, all along, she hasn't changed. She's always been petrified of him. So he's gone through this whole journey of wanting this woman and falling in love with her. And it's all for nothing, really, because he ultimately dies for the sake of someone who not only does not love him in return, but fears him. And that's the tragedy of the whole thing. And, when he gets shot and his arm goes like that and he falls to his death, it's really powerful and it hits you hard. And so it's something that's much more than a theme park movie, as a great man might say. It gives you all the thrills and excitement and sense of adventure that you'd come from expect, but it gives you more than just a thrill. It's an emotional experience which connects on a personal level.
So when Cooper was brought onto RKO, he basically wanted to get what he called his giant terror gorilla movie done, and he obviously was trying to figure out a way to do it, and a lot of people said, oh, you should put him in a gorilla suit, that's the cheap way. But Cooper was like, no, that's just too easy to spot. So he basically had seen O'Brien's test screenings of Creation and thought, wait a minute, why don't I just use that to create my giant terror gorilla? So he obviously had O'Brien sign some contracts and cancel the project to work on Kong, but a lot of the dinosaurs that were in Creation were later used in King Kong. So in a way, it was sort of recycling special effects that weren't going to be used. In fact, the creation test footage was supposed to be in the movie Kong at some point when the sailors are being chased by all the dinosaurs before they get to the log scene. One of those sailors was supposed to come across this baby Triceratops and shoot it, and the mother chases him down and mauls him to death. There were a lot of stuff with the Triceratops puppets that were planned but never really shot or completed. There's a deleted scene, which you can see in some concept art, where Kong is in a quicksand and he's fighting off 2 Triceratops. That was in the storyboards and in the script for a long time. But eventually the filmmakers thought, let's just cut it and just cut to the chase, and that's what led up to from the Brontosaurus to the log scene. There's a lot of stuff in between that period of the movie that were pitched but were ultimately cut for pacing reasons. To my knowledge, the missing spider pit scene is gone. It does no longer exist, because back then they didn't think to save all this stuff for DVDs. There were no DVDs, there wasn't even home video back then. It's just when a movie's out, that's it, and then if it's gone, it's gone. You know, it's one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences, but from my knowledge, I think the spider pit scene is probably gone, and the only way we can really see it is through the script, through storyboards, through production stills, and fan-made versions, which are somewhat pretty good, but I feel most of them don't capture the magic that I think O'Brien really put in that sequence. They're not scary enough, essentially.
They interviewed me from England once before for a book on the spider pit scene, and they ended up turning it into a three-part article on Film Facts. I was interviewed for 2 hours, and I was just, the only thing was I was a little disappointed that the gist of the articles was it shot or wasn't it shot? You know, was it alive or was it not done? And I have proof from Cooper it was shot, and so they left it up to the reader. What do you think? Which surprised me a little bit, because there was enough. We have enough evidence it was shot.
I think it's the reason they go back and look at Frankenstein and Dracula and the Werewolf of London and the Wolfman and all of the what are now called the origin stories of all of these remakes, because they didn't have any of the sci-fi, the sci-tech breakthroughs that they have now, but they managed to mesmerize people, and partially it was because people they were mesmerizing had really never seen anything like this before. Because it was a much more protected culture than it is now. I mean, it was everything was being opened up by the movies, and now we're much more jaded. But what's fascinating is that people go back and look at these originals, and they are mesmerized by them again, because they have such style and they have such simplicity. And even if you have to sort of say, well, that looks fake, you know, and that dinosaur, I mean, God knows he would never live in Jurassic Park. But still, there's something, I guess primal is the word, about seeing all of that and realizing that it was all being done during the Depression. And that was part of the draw of the movie, is that it took you out of the horrible world you were living in to this exotic world where there were these creatures, these prehistoric creatures, who somehow had survived everything. This was the pre-atomic age too, so they had survived World War I and the stock market crash, so they were interesting. Also, there's a great build-up in the first movie with the natives and the before the reveal of Kong, and you get from the cast the idea of what are they worshiping? What is this thing that they are making such a production out? And then he appears, and you go, "Oh my God, what is that?" And I guess it's that. I mean, I don't think that, like, you know, that millions and millions of people search out the original King Kong. I think it's a small, tasteful audience that is interested in this kind of thing that does it. You know, it's not. I mean, if you went around the world and talked about King Kong, they would, you know, refer back to something closer to their own experience.
And George Lucas, when he made Star Wars, in the book about the making of Star Wars, credited the fact that Star Wars was the first change in that technology since King Kong. That's a huge nod to the creative genius of Uncle Marion and his team. So there were lots of things about King Kong that even while we watch it today and look at it as being, as I said, totally archaic, and you and I can tell the stop motion filming that was, shall we say, new and a little bit jittery. And of course, every time that Willis O'Brien touched the little model that he made, the fur would be affected. So what you really see if you're looking at it is the fact that the fur seems to change on Kong in every shot as the shots go on, because it's been crunched by his fingers and tried to bring it back again. But it was a fascinating film. The other part that I loved about his story, which I had not realized, said the Great Wall. The Great Wall was, of course, put up for, I can't remember the name of the film, was it King of Kings or something like that? It was a silent film made in the late 20s, where it was the Great Wall of Jerusalem. And he rebuilt it as the Great Wall for the King Kong set. And it is that Great Wall which you see being burned as the city of Atlanta in the beginning of Gone with the Wind, which Uncle Marion was also connected with. And this history goes on and on.
What's your name?
Andero.
Fine. I've got a job for you. Costumes on the ship will fit you. Broadway shops are still open. I can get some clothes for you there. Come on.
But what is it?
It's money and adventure and fame. It's the thrill of a lifetime and a long sea voyage that starts at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning.
No, wait. I don't understand. You must tell me. I do want the job so, but I can't.
Oh, I see. Oh, you've got me wrong. This is strictly business.
Well, I only wanted...
Sure you did. I got a little excited and I forgot you didn't understand. Listen, I'm Carl Denham. Ever hear of me?
That T-Rex fight is freaking insane. I love that sequence. That is one of the most iconic scenes in cinema. I think actually it overrides the Empire State Building scene, which, as classic as that is, as iconic as that is, seeing Kong fight the greatest terror of the jungle, of the prehistoric dinosaur times, essentially, is one of the greatest scenes in cinema. And to this day, I think T-Rex has never really recovered from that fight. I mean, he recovered from, like, Jurassic Park fighting the Spinosaur and a couple other movies, but the scars from Kong still linger in between his jaws, if you know what I mean. Man, that's a Mortal Kombat kill right there. Now, when they were shooting the movie, the Empire State Building didn't exist. Cooper was going for a couple other buildings, and one of the understudies was the Chrysler Building. But by the time they started photography on the original, the Empire State Building was constructed, and Cooper just looked at that and said, put the monkey on top of there. It's bigger, it's taller, so it'll make the impact more powerful. And to this day, as much as there have been other towers that have been built that are higher, to me, the Empire State Building is the crown jewel of Manhattan. It's what makes the city so iconic.
The two men who are in the head of King Kong that you see in close-ups, that was all done in Hollywood. The arm was run by pneumatic something. That was an actual sized arm. And the other thing that Uncle Marion said, which I think has probably not been emphasized enough, was that Kong changes in size greatly throughout the movie. He said, you look at the size of him climbing up the Empire State Building, that clearly has to be much bigger than any other shot of Kong in perspective. But who cared? He was climbing the Empire State Building.
I haven't shown it to my own children because my wife says no, it's too scary, it scare the life out of them. And but there is the Anthony Brown children's book, which I've read to them numerous times, and that they love that. I can see my 2-year-old son one day. I can't wait to show him the film once he's old enough. And so it's something that people pass down from generation to generation. And in this day and age, what is great, it's easier than ever for people to experience classic movies because of the internet and streaming and so on. Whereas in the old days, you had to wait for a film to come on TV, and you might only know this is supposed to be a great movie because it's got a good review in the Radio Times. Whereas because of the internet, people have more of an awareness of classic films and their legacy and so on. So it means people are more likely to see them, I hope. And frankly, Kong is popular. He's always been popular. He's always made money. As long as there's that there, you always get Hollywood doing various reboots, remakes, and so on. As to what extent culturally that's a good thing is a matter for debate, because a lot of these films aren't really made for love. They're as I say, they're made just for commerce, really, to cash in on something that people love. But yeah, the legacy of Kong will always continue, I think, definitely. I mean, it's amazing that this is a film. There aren't many films that are 85, 90 years old, whereby people still have an awareness. If you were to walk up to someone on the street and mention the name of that film, they would know that film. But King Kong is one of those very few films, along with The Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind. It's very much part of popular culture. So people, even if they haven't seen it, they have an awareness of it.
Without a doubt, King Kong is my favorite Max Steiner score. It's the first one I heard, the first one I fell in love with. And Ray Bradbury and Ray Harryhausen, both of whom I got to know later in life, both of them said the same thing, that they could hear the music in their minds when they were away from the movie. And then years later, when there were recordings of the music, when they heard the score of King Kong, they could vividly picture the imagery. So I think it's one of the most perfect examples out of all the movies made ever since. It remains for me one of the greatest examples of the pairing of music and image to go together, where you can't think of one without the other. I have seen early films without any music back in the days when Max Steiner wasn't allowed to put an underscoring because the producers were worried that it was going to confuse moviegoers. And boy, some of those movies are really, really slow. And you hear the crackle and hiss of the early film emulsion on these early film soundtracks. And they just, some of them feel deadly. Some of them are like 90-minute movies feel like they're 3 hours long. Well, Max knew that music could not only make a film feel faster and up the pace by adding the music, but by giving characters certain themes and then changing that theme from happy to sad, or he could show one character and play the theme for another character, and we'd know that character number one was thinking about character number two because of the music. Music does so much to bring us inside a movie, make us connect to those characters. And Max was the first one really to understand that, and the first one to put that into motion in Hollywood. And he set the bar that composers have been following ever since.
Skipper, believe it or not, there's a little Kong. What? A little? How little?
Son of Kong is one of those sequels that either people love or hate, and I actually kind of like it. The only thing I actually don't like is anything on the island. I think the first 2/3 of the movie with Cooper and Englehorn and them going through all the shipment travels and trying to get away from the authorities and all the dialogue and stuff, that's the best part of the movie. But what really makes it go quicky snappy is when Kiko, the son of Kong, shows up. And to me, as much as there was an original pitch for a bigger movie for a sequel, that's where the movie ultimately suffers. And it's a shame because despite Willis O'Brien's animation on that movie looking fantastic, it ultimately just kind of is just there, and it has no relevance, like really any emotion to the story. I mean, even Kiko dies at the end, saving Carl Denham. It's like, okay, we're doing the whole saving the person he cares about again. We've seen this before, and I don't blame Cooper or any of the filmmakers involved. I think they absolutely tried, but it's more the studio saying, we want this out the same year as the original and 9 months. Like, they had to get that done from March 33 to December, and for a sequel, that's insane.
I enjoyed Son of Kong. It's a sweet film. It's an inoffensive film. The most interesting thing that I find about Son of Kong is the poster sitting behind Carl Denham's desk, the giant poster proclaiming Carl Denham's monster, which I think is wonderful. Don't know who has that, but I wish it were me.
But did you see the musical?
No, I haven't.
Stage musical? No, well, no, that was the real spectacle. I saw that in New York, and in that one, the Fay Wray character, she was played by a very fierce black actress, and it had been rewritten so that she was in charge of Kong. She was not going to put up with any of his crap, and she was a feminist. It was just pre-Me Too, but she was not going to allow this gorilla to get away with anything. And that was an interesting take. And this, I don't know her name, but she was very good in it. Now, that show originated in Australia, and I don't know if that was the Australians who had written it that way or if it had gotten rewritten for America. But it didn't last on Broadway because basically, aside from her, it was all about the puppeteers who were all dressed as ninjas, and you saw them. So you saw as the puppet was amazing, but he did all of his tricks by the end of Act 1. There was nothing new in Act 2. So it even the tourists kind of the word got out that it wasn't really worth the money.
Basically, Kong was just the catalyst for me. It drove me to be a more creative person. It resonated with me as an artist to know that there are things you can achieve even when the technology necessarily isn't there yet. You can achieve amazing things, and you can make it happen through sheer willpower and sheer passion and sheer drive.
Briefly, when I was a kid, my mom used to tell me stories about how when she was a young lady back in the 1930s, she had seen a movie about a gigantic gorilla climbing the Empire State Building with a woman in his paws and invading New York City. And I had never seen the film. It captured my imagination. I dreamt about it for years and always longed to see it. Finally, somewhere, I think in the late 1950s, it aired on television for the first time, and then 1 week later it played at my local movie theater, the Benner, at a Saturday matinee. And I can remember sitting in the theater watching the coming attractions and seeing the giant gates opening, and my eyes grew wide and my mouth opened in amazement. And there was King Kong.
I was about 6 years old, and my father was a huge film lover, especially of adventure films. I had the videotape of Kong, and he showed me the film on a Saturday afternoon, which was one of our weekend rituals. I remember from the start, just blew me away, made me dream, took me to another destination. As I was sitting on a couch, it was magic. When they killed King Kong at the end of the film, it was the first time I felt like crying when watching the film. I also credit King Kong for triggering my love for animals. From that moment, I understood how magic storytelling and cinema was. It was traveling and staying on a couch. Imagination being the key to escape.
People who have had that experience in their lives, or presently or in the past, have a certain connection with him that they feel this connection with someone who's a bit different, if you know what I mean, or outcast. So there is a certain degree of emotional connection there.
I cannot remember a movie experience that for me on television was more immersive. And this is back in the early 70s when TVs were really small, about the size of an iPad without the good picture quality. And yet I felt I was on Skull Island. And then I felt like I was in Manhattan on opening night when Kong was unveiled to that audience. So it just pulled me in as a child. And I would do drawings of King Kong with my older brother. I found those recently. And it's so kind of funny and makes me happy to think that some 45 years later, I was asked to tell the story of the man who wrote that music that I think is such an important part of King Kong's success.
I remember seeing the original King Kong for the very first time was when my two uncles, who actually worked in the film industry here in Toronto, had brought over a ton of VHS tapes for me and my sister to watch. They were big into movies and they wanted to educate me on film. So they brought over 4 movies. They brought in the first 2 Jaws movies, and they brought in the original King Kong and the sequel King Kong Lives. At the time, I was probably about 4 or 5 years old when I saw the original, and I really thought nothing of it, to be honest. I mean, I thought it was a fun little classic movie, black and white, great effects and everything. I remember mostly the dinosaur sequences and the Empire State Building battle. Those were like the top tier scenes that I remember the most as a kid. After that, King Kong was just kind of there for most of the time in pop culture. My second exposure to King Kong was riding the Kongfrontation attraction at Universal Studios Florida. That was a terrifying experience for a 7-8-year-old back in '98, and I remember clearly seeing Kong right in my face. It was a real big full-size animatronic King Kong with banana breath and hot fire. It was hot as lava in that soundstage, but when Kong grabbed you, it terrified me. It scared the snot out of me. It was the first time I felt fear in the beast's size. Like, I think we all go through the different emotions with King Kong. It goes from awe, it goes to fear, and then it goes to sympathy, and then it goes to sadness. We all have these range of emotions that we feel for this character.
Originally, we went to Universal Studios, Florida, and they had the Kongfrontation ride. And I rode that, I think I was about 7 years old. And I was, of course, completely terrified by this thing. Of course, it was the life-size animatronic head. It's not there anymore. They have the Mummy ride there now. But ever since then, I feel like that trip to Universal when I was 7 changed a lot of things about my life and guided my interests a certain way, because not only did I get to see King Kong, I got to visit the Psycho House, which was at Universal at that time, because they were filming Psycho 4, so they had built a new version of the house back there. I saw the Alfred Hitchcock show. I saw the Universal Monsters for the first time, dancing along with Beetlejuice in a review. You know, it was all silly stuff. But as a 7-year-old, I was thinking, I want to know more about this. I want to know more about this. I want to know more about this too. Years went by, and my grandma actually bought me King Kong versus Godzilla on VHS. And this was right around the time Jurassic Park had come out, so I was really into dinosaurs. So I put this movie in and I'm like, this is awesome. This is incredible. I could tell they were guys in suits, but it was so much fun and I had such an enjoyable time watching it. And then I was thinking, well, I really want to see the original King Kong. And from there, it took me a while to find it, but I eventually found it at a Blockbuster on VHS. I rented it and I actually made a copy of it for myself. I put 2 VCRs together and I made this really cool artwork for it as a 7 or 8 year old. And at that time, it was about the oldest film I had ever seen. But I was really impressed by it because it seemed so modern by comparison. You know, this film was only about 5 or 6 years removed from The Jazz Singer, which was the first talkie. And it felt more like Star Wars than the original Dracula, if that makes sense. The original Dracula, as great as it is, those original Universal films, You know, there's no soundtrack really. It's basically a stage show that's recorded on film. So 2 years removed from Dracula, you have this film with a full symphonic orchestra, amazing special effects for the time, amazing special effects even for now, very impressive. Everything feels legitimate and feels real. Fay Wray, Robert Armstrong, Bruce Cabot, I love the cast. Fay Wray is obviously incredibly beautiful in that film.
King Kong is the very best kind of movie monster, if we want to call him a monster even, and that is the kind that we can relate to, whether it's Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster or Lon Chaney Jr. as Larry Talbot, who becomes the Wolfman. The creatures that I think live longest in our memory are the ones where we relate to them in some way. And of course, at first, when you first see King Kong, I'm sure most moviegoers don't think, oh, I can totally relate to that character. But by the end of the movie, when Kong has fallen so deeply in love that he's completely lost track of everything. He was once the king, as Carl Denham tells us, and then he's lying on a pavement, you know, brought down by civilization. I think we can all relate to having our spirits crushed, of falling in love that isn't reciprocated, of being taken out of a place that's comfortable and being that we know, and being brought into a place that isn't comfortable for us. I mean, there's so many ways that we can relate to King Kong. And Max Steiner knew that. He knew that this was not just a movie about a big gorilla. He understood the underpinnings of it. And that's why I think we love King Kong, because in a way, we are all King Kong a little bit. You know, Merian C. Cooper, who created him, liked to say, I'm Kong. And while I wouldn't go so far as to say that I'm Kong, I would say I relate to Kong.
Did you ever hear of Kong?
Why, yes. Some native superstition, isn't it? A god or a spirit or something.
Well, anyway, neither beast nor man. Something monstrous, all-powerful, still living, still holding that island in a grip of deadly fear. Well, every legend has a basis of truth. I tell you, there's something on that island that no white man has ever seen.
And you expect to photograph it?
If it's there, you bet I'll photograph it.
Suppose it doesn't like having its picture taken.
Well, now you know why I brought along those cases of gas bombs.
Although I never met Coop for the last 8 years of his life, from 1965 through 1973, we maintained an intense, very, very close correspondence, to the point where I would be getting mail from him perhaps as often as 3, 4, 5 times a week. Letters, telegrams, autographed pictures. We maintained that correspondence until he died. And as I say, we became extremely close friends through correspondence over those last 8 years of his life. He told me that if I ever came to California, he would introduce me to Fay Wray. Well, I didn't get to California till 1974, a year after he passed. But I contacted Ronald Gottesman at Rutgers University, who I knew. He was a professor. Ron had written a book, the very first book actually ever published about the making of King Kong. It came out in 1976 from Avon Books and was called The Girl in the Hairy Paw. Now, the making of King Kong beat us to the marketplace by several months, but our book was in preparation and production from 1972 through 1976. So even though they beat us to the bookstores, we were actually the first book ever published about King Kong. And I had written a series of articles for a new tabloid in New York City called the Monster Times. It was the first, a lot of firsts here, it was the very first monster bi-weekly tabloid. And it came out every other week in New York City. And the very first issue in winter of 1972 featured my series of articles on the making and production of King Kong on the cover. and continued for several issues. Not long after that, I was contacted by two college professors, Ronald Gottesman at Rutgers University and Harry M. Gettold at Indiana University, about a book that they were preparing about the making of King Kong, which is to be called The Girl in the Hairy Paw. They had originally gone to Prentice Hall, but that deal fell through when management changed, and they eventually published it through Avon Books. And so when I got to California in 1974, as I say, Ron Gottesman had given me the address for Fay Wray, and so I wrote her, and I told her about my long friendship with Coop and the fact that if I ever came out west, he would have introduced me. And she was very sweet. She wrote me back and said, yes, of course we must meet. So I got out there and arranged to meet her. I went with my brother and my then girlfriend to her apartment in Century City, California. And we got there and she was not home as yet. It was in the morning. And we were told that she had had an emergency and wasn't sure when she'd be returning. As we were preparing to leave, Fay Wray walked through the door. And she was very gracious. She apologized. She said that one of her best friends had passed away and she had gone to the funeral. And I felt really bad. I said, look, we can do this another time. I understand that you're grieving. This might not be the right time to sit down and talk about King Kong. And I'll never forget, she raised her hand and said, no, that's fine. Life must go on. So we followed her upstairs to her apartment and spent 2 wonderful hours with her. I remember she asked me if I'd go to the refrigerator and get some Cokes for all of us and pour them into a glass. And as luck would have it, the first Coke that I opened from her refrigerator exploded in my hand and spilled all over the kitchen sink and the floor, and I was devastated. And she laughed about it. But we had a lovely 2 hours. I met her husband toward the end of the afternoon. He was a physician, Dr. Rosenberg, as I recall. But we talked about about the making of Kong. She spoke of Marion Cooper. She adored him. They were dear, dear friends up until his death. She loved Robert Armstrong and said that she still got together with Bob Armstrong on a regular basis at that point in 1974, and they visited along with the schoedsacks, Ernest B. Schoedsack and his wife. I asked her about Bruce Cabot, and her face turned to stone, and there was silence for a moment, and she said, I really would rather not talk about him. So I don't know what went down with them. I've always heard that Cabot was something of a ladies' man, so perhaps he came on a little too strongly and she resented it. But she loved talking about Cooper and Schoedsack and Bob Armstrong in particular, but refused to discuss Bruce Cabot.
My contribution to King Kong was simple. Was back in 2010, my family and I went to a trip to Universal Studios Hollywood. We went on the backlot tour, and the new King Kong 360 3D attraction had opened. Now, the King Kong encounter in Hollywood had since burned down, which sucks, because I really wanted to experience that at some point, but fates have it, it didn't happen. But after 5 years since the Peter Jackson movie came out, I saw that Kong still had relevance, and at the time I had just gotten new tech and new HD cameras and a new computer, and I was just starting off my YouTube channel, and I thought, why don't I actually just try to do a remake, my own personal remake of Kong? So it started writing the script in 2010. I got my cast together from my high school buddies, and we just shot this thing for about 5 years with effects, with actors, and a lot of running and jumping through the forest. So it's just 5 or 6 years of our life, spending $4,000, and it's almost at 1 million views on YouTube. It was just a real learning curve for me in how to make movies, and it made me appreciate so much more of what it took to make the original. And to that end, I've essentially gained the full Kong experience. I've made the movies, I've experienced the rides, I've watched all the films, and my remake is sort of a love letter to all the films that have come before it. It's like a giant frickin' sandwich of all the Kong movies meshed together into one. Outside of that, I just do my King Kong reviews, which as of this recording has over 76 episodes, how appropriate. But it really took off, and it was more out of a response to other reviewers who hadn't really covered all the Kong movies, and more so the Godzilla movies and other films. And I wanted to do my own style, my own kind of review series, and since then it's really gained me a following, and again, I'm so grateful to what Kong has brought on for almost the last 90 years. It's crazy.
I don't know if you can see it or how well you can see it.
Yeah.
This is one of the actual surviving fins from the Stegosaurus model in King Kong.
Oh, wow. That.
I have that encased in plexiglass. Again, I'm not sure how well you can see it over there.
Yeah, you can see it fine.
But that was sent me, I don't know, 30 years ago by a composer friend in LA who had stumbled upon some of these from another collector, and we were good buddies. He said, "Would you like one?" And I said, "Well, I would, but I don't want to mortgage my house to buy it." He said, no, it's a gift. So he sent it to me, and I had it encased in plexiglass.
Someone sent me this audio recording, recorded off an original 78 that was used for radio promotional material. And it was incredible. Obviously, it was made for radio, so there's a narrator and a voiceover, but they actually had audio from the film included in. So I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, wow, wouldn't this be great to go back and add visuals to this? Because to my knowledge, there never was an official trailer for the 33 Kong. The one most people associate as the original trailer was I think the 1938 re-release trailer, which always threw me as a kid because I saw the trailer and it said, "Don't miss it this time" at the end. I was thinking, don't miss it this time. And then it was years later I realized it was for the re-release. So I said, since Kong 33 never had an original trailer, wouldn't it be awesome to put together this radio broadcast and add visuals to it? And that came out so well, and so many people were impressed by it and enjoyed it so much. And sometimes I look back on it and watch it again, and I watch it as someone who didn't create it. I watch it as a separate person. I think, wow, this is really cool. If they'd played this in theaters in 33, this really would have won a lot of people over.
Well, I also wanted to mention that I got to know Dorothy Jordan, who of course was Marion Cooper's widow. And years after Cooper had died, I contacted Dorothy. She lived in Coronado, which was the family home. And she invited my brother Erwin and I over there. I was staying with him in LA at his apartment, and we drove to Coronado and spent the afternoon with Dorothy and her son Richard, who I understand passed away sadly not terribly long ago. But Richard was there. He was then active military. I remember he was in full uniform. And Dorothy, when I met Dorothy, I understood why Cooper cast Fay Wray in King Kong, because Dorothy looked remarkably like Fay, at least when I met Fay at age 70 years of age. There was really a great resemblance between the two. And if you look at Dorothy in the opening scenes of John Ford's The Searchers, you'll see that there is that striking resemblance to Fay Wray. But she was quite lovely. She showed me, I held in my hands the original shooting script for Kong, and it had all of Cooper's handwritten notes throughout the pages. I stood right next to the caricature that the cast and crew of Kong had presented Cooper in 1932 as a Christmas gift, with Cooper with the bullhorn in caricature yelling, make it bigger, make it bigger. And there, I mean, it was legendary. I'd seen pictures of it, I think, in Famous Monsters magazine, and heard about it, and there it was right in front of me. And I remembered telling Dorothy at the time that I owned a 16mm print of King Kong, And I remember her holding my hands in hers, tearing up and saying, well, if anyone deserves to have that, you do. And following that train of thought, I teared up and I shook my head as we were leaving and said, I wish Coop was able to have been here. And she smiled and said, he's here, he's here. And that's a memory I've kept with me all these years.